Imagine commanding the most powerful nation on Earth and being publicly mocked by your own allies. Imagine standing at the head of a nuclear superpower while another communist leader ridiculed your policies, questioned your courage, and challenged your authority before the entire world. Now imagine that both men controlled armies numbering in the millions, possessed access to nuclear weapons, and represented rival visions for the future of communism. This was not a conflict between East and West. This was a secret war fought inside the communist world itself. A war of humiliation, a war of insults, a war of egos. And at its center stood two of the most powerful and dangerous men of the 20th century, Nikita Khrushchev and Mao Zedong. Their bitter rivalry would fracture the communist bloc, reshape Cold War strategy, and create opportunities that American leaders would eventually use to alter the global balance of power. To the outside world, the Soviet Union and Communist China appeared united. They denounced capitalism together. They condemned American influence together. They celebrated revolution together. But behind the carefully staged photographs and public declarations of friendship, resentment was growing. And before long, that resentment would explode into one of the strangest and most consequential feuds of the Cold War. To understand how it happened, we have to return to years immediately following the Second World War. By 1949, Mao Zedong had achieved what many believed impossible. After decades of civil war, invasion, and political chaos, communist forces emerged victorious in China. The People's Republic of China was proclaimed in Beijing, and one quarter of humanity suddenly found itself under communist rule. For leaders in Washington, the event was alarming. For leaders in Moscow, it appeared to be a historic triumph. At last, the Soviet Union had a powerful ideological partner in Asia. Joseph Stalin welcomed Mao into the communist camp, but the relationship was never entirely comfortable. Stalin viewed himself as the unquestioned leader of world communism. Mao, meanwhile, saw himself as the architect of a revolutionary victory unlike any other. Even during their early meetings, there were signs of tension. Mao expected respect. Stalin expected obedience. Neither man was particularly interested in giving the other what he wanted. Still, necessity kept the partnership alive. China needed industrial assistance, technical expertise, and military support. The Soviet Union wanted a strong ally on its eastern flank. For a time, both sides benefited. Soviet engineers traveled to China. Factories were constructed. Infrastructure expanded. Military cooperation increased. To many observers, the Communist alliance seemed stronger than ever. Then everything changed. In March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. His death created a power struggle inside the Soviet Union and opened the door for a new leader to emerge. That leader was Nikita Khrushchev. Unlike Stalin, Khrushchev possessed a very different personality. He could be loud, impulsive, and unpredictable. He often spoke bluntly. He enjoyed dramatic gestures, and he believed the Soviet Union needed a new direction. At first, Mao welcomed the change. Without Stalin dominating the communist world, the Chinese leader believed he might gain greater influence. But Khrushchev had his own ideas, and those ideas would soon become the source of an extraordinary conflict. In 1956, Khrushchev delivered one of the most shocking speeches in communist history. During a closed session of the Soviet Communist Party Congress, he condemned Stalin's crimes, his cult of personality, and many of the brutal policies that had defined the previous era. The speech sent shockwaves across the communist world. For many Soviet citizens, it was astonishing. For communist parties abroad, it was deeply unsettling. For Mao Zedong, it was infuriating. Mao had built his own authority around many of the same principles Khrushchev was now attacking. He viewed Stalin's mistakes differently. More importantly, he saw Khrushchev's criticism as dangerous. If communists began questioning Stalin, they might eventually question other revolutionary leaders as well, including Mao himself. The disagreement was about more than history. It was about power. It was about legitimacy. And it was about who would lead the communist world in the decades ahead. As tensions quietly increased, Khrushchev introduced another controversial idea. He argued that communism and capitalism could compete without necessarily fighting a nuclear war. The Soviet leader believed peaceful coexistence with the West was possible. Mao completely rejected the concept. To him, the struggle between communism and capitalism remained inevitable. Compromise appeared weak. Negotiation appeared suspicious. And every Soviet attempt to reduce tensions with the United States seemed, in Mao's eyes, like surrender. The seeds of a dangerous rivalry had been planted. What began as ideological disagreement was slowly becoming personal. And soon, the humiliation would begin. The first major confrontations between Mao and Khrushchev did not happen on battlefields. They happened in meeting rooms, and they were often painfully awkward. In 1958, Khrushchev traveled to Beijing expecting discussions between equals. Instead, he found himself participating in what many historians would later describe as a deliberate exercise in humiliation. One of the most famous incidents occurred during a meeting near Mao's private swimming pool. Mao enjoyed conducting political discussions while floating in the water. Khrushchev, who was not a strong swimmer, was reportedly forced to wear flotation devices while trying to discuss serious geopolitical matters. The image was almost absurd. The leader of the Soviet Union struggling to stay afloat while Mao calmly floated nearby. Chinese officials found it amusing. Khrushchev did not. To him, the event was a calculated insult. To Mao, it demonstrated that he would not treat Soviet leaders as superior figures. The relationship deteriorated rapidly after that. Meetings became increasingly hostile. Public statements became sharper. Private conversations became even worse. Each leader believed the other lacked the qualities necessary to lead the communist movement. Khrushchev viewed Mao as reckless and dangerously ideological. Mao viewed Khrushchev as weak and overly concerned with compromise. Then came one of the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. The late 1950s and early 1960s witnessed growing crises across the world. Berlin remained divided. Nuclear arsenals expanded at an alarming pace. American and Soviet forces watched one another constantly. Every major decision carried global consequences. Instead of presenting a united communist front, however, Moscow and Beijing increasingly argued over strategy. The disagreements became especially intense regarding nuclear weapons. China wanted greater access to Soviet technology and expertise. Initially, Moscow had been willing to cooperate, but as Mao's behavior became more unpredictable, Soviet leaders grew concerned. Would Beijing use nuclear power responsibly? Could Mao be trusted with advanced military technology? Khrushchev eventually decided the risks were too great. The Soviet Union began withdrawing support. Scientific cooperation slowed. Military assistance was reduced. Joint projects were canceled. To Mao, this felt like betrayal. The Soviet Union had promised partnership. Now it was acting like a rival. The bitterness deepened. Meanwhile, American intelligence agencies watched these developments carefully. At first, many Western analysts struggled to believe what they were seeing. The idea of a serious conflict between the world's two largest communist powers seemed almost impossible. Yet evidence continued to accumulate. Diplomatic reports revealed growing hostility. Propaganda publications attacked one another with increasing frequency. Officials exchanged accusations behind closed doors. The Communist alliance was beginning to crack. For Washington, this possibility was enormously important. Since the beginning of the Cold War, American planners had feared the combined strength of Moscow and Beijing. Together, they represented vast populations, enormous military forces, and immense geographic reach. But if that partnership collapsed, the strategic landscape would change dramatically. The United States did not create the split, but American leaders understood its significance. And as Mao and Khrushchev pushed further apart, Washington quietly recognized an opportunity that could eventually transform the Cold War itself. The turning point was approaching, and it would arrive during one of the most dangerous confrontations in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Instead of bringing communist leaders together, the crisis would drive them even further apart, and the war of humiliation would become impossible to hide. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. For 13 terrifying days, American and Soviet leaders faced decisions that could have triggered global catastrophe. Warships moved into position. Strategic bombers stood ready. Missiles waited on launch pads. Across the world, millions feared that civilization itself might be hours away from destruction. When the crisis ended, President John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev had succeeded in pulling back from the brink. But Mao Zedong saw the outcome very differently. To Mao, Khrushchev had backed down. Instead of confronting the United States, the Soviet leader had negotiated. Instead of demonstrating revolutionary strength, he had accepted compromise. The criticism was relentless. Chinese officials openly attacked Soviet policy. Communist newspapers accused Moscow of weakness. What had once been private disagreements now became public warfare. Soon, both governments were publishing lengthy ideological attacks against one another. Each side claimed to represent the true future of communism. Each side accused the other of betrayal. And each side sought supporters throughout the developing world. The conflict was no longer merely personal. It had become a struggle for global influence. As the feud intensified, Soviet experts and advisors began leaving China. Joint projects collapsed. Economic cooperation suffered. Military coordination nearly disappeared. The split became impossible to ignore. Then came an even more dramatic development. In 1964, China successfully tested its first atomic bomb. For Mao, it was a historic achievement. China had entered the nuclear age without Soviet assistance. For Moscow, the event was deeply unsettling. Now, two hostile communist powers possessed nuclear weapons. The rivalry was becoming increasingly dangerous. Yet, the worst was still ahead. By the late 1960s, tensions along the massive Sino-Soviet border had reached alarming levels. Troops gathered on both sides. Fortifications expanded. Military commanders prepared contingency plans. What had started as arguments between political leaders was beginning to resemble preparations for war. Then, in 1969, fighting finally erupted. Chinese and Soviet forces clashed along disputed sections of the border near Jinbao Island. Shots were fired. Soldiers were killed. Armored units deployed. For a brief moment, the world witnessed the unthinkable. Communist powers were fighting each other directly. Even more alarming were reports that Soviet leaders considered military strikes against Chinese nuclear facilities. The possibility of war between two nuclear-armed communist states suddenly appeared real. American intelligence agencies monitored every development. In Washington, policymakers understood the significance immediately. The Soviet Union and China were no longer uneasy partners. They had become rivals. And that rivalry would soon create one of the greatest diplomatic opportunities of the Cold War. The opportunity was obvious, but taking advantage of it would require extraordinary patience and strategic vision. For 2 decades, American policymakers had viewed the communist world as a largely unified bloc. Now, that assumption was collapsing. The growing hostility between Beijing and Moscow created possibilities that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. American diplomats began carefully exploring ways to improve relations with China. Every move was calculated, every signal was deliberate, and every step carried enormous geopolitical consequences. The breakthrough came in the early 1970s. In 1972, President Richard Nixon arrived in Beijing for one of the most significant diplomatic visits in modern history. The images stunned the world. An American president meeting face-to-face with the leadership of Communist China. What made the moment remarkable was not simply the meeting itself. It was the fact that the Soviet Union now had to consider the possibility of facing pressure from both East and West. The rivalry between Mao and Khrushchev and later Soviet leaders had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. The Communist alliance that once appeared unbreakable had fractured under the weight of ambition, ideology, and personal pride. Neither Mao nor Khrushchev had intended to strengthen the position of the United States. Yet their struggle accomplished exactly that. Their feud divided resources. Their competition weakened cooperation. And their mutual distrust created opportunities that skilled American diplomacy was ready to exploit. What makes this story so fascinating is that it was never simply a clash of nations. It was a clash of personalities. Two revolutionary leaders who believed they were defending the future of communism ultimately spent years undermining one another. Their war was fought with speeches, propaganda, diplomatic insults, and strategic maneuvering, but its consequences were global. The rivalry influenced military planning, nuclear strategy, international alliances, and the course of the Cold War itself. In the end, one of the greatest threats facing the communist world did not come from Washington, London, or NATO. It came from within. From two powerful leaders who could not tolerate sharing influence, prestige, or authority, and in their determination to defeat each other, they changed history. The secret war of humiliation between communist leaders reminds us that the Cold War was not only a struggle between East and West, it was also a struggle within the communist world itself, a conflict driven by ego, ideology, and the pursuit of power. For more stories about the hidden rivalries, secret operations, and defining moments of the Cold War, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and support the channel.